in the portion of Tzav, the Torah speaks about the burnt offering, how it's burnt on the altar, and how there's a mitzvah that it should be burnt, and there's a mitzvah for the Kohanim to add wood to the altar. And then the Torah says, Lo tichbeh. There's a negative commandment that one is not permitted to extinguish the fire under the Mizbeach. There's a positive commandment to add multiple times during the day wood onto the Mizbeach. And there's a negative commandment to extinguish the fire of the Mizbeach, of the altar. The Chinuch, who's a codifier, who codifies the positive, negative commandments of the mitzvah, he offers a rational understanding for every one of the positive, negative commandments of the Torah. And when he speaks about the positive commandment of adding wood to the altar and the negative commandment of extinguishing the fire of the altar, he goes to explain it this way. During the first temple period, miraculously, there was a fire which descended from heaven, and this really began when Aaron was installed on the 8th day together with his sons as Kohanim, as priests. When did the divine presence enter into the Mishkan? A fire came down from heaven onto the Mizbeach, onto the altar. All the Jews, when they saw this, they prostrated themselves to acknowledge God's presence. The fire of the altar was a spiritual fire. The Talmud tells us in Zvachim, in Tractate Zvachim, that when King Solomon built the first temple, Beis Hamikdash, he brought endless numbers of sacrifices to inaugurate the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara has a difficulty. How is it possible, by speaking about the specifications of the altar, for so many thousands of offerings to be burnt in such a short period of time? How's it possible? So the Talmud tells us that would have been a problem if it would have been a human fire. But because it was a spiritual fire on the Mizbeach, a spiritual fire burns on it with an unlimited capacity, and that's why, regardless of the unlimited numbers, relatively speaking, of sacrifices that were brought in honor of the inauguration of the Mizbeach, of the altar, they were totally consumed. So this was a spiritual fire. So if there's a spiritual fire, what do we need wood? Why do the Kohanim, the priests, have to add wood a number of times throughout the day? Why is there a negative commandment not to extinguish the fire? Well, let us understand, if it's a spiritual fire cannot be extinguished. Only a physical human fire could be extinguished. What would be if one would extinguish the fire of the altar of the Mizbeach, or if the Kohen would not bring wood, add wood to the Mizbeach? So the miracle of the divine fire would be obvious to all. When a miracle is obvious and cannot be denied under any circumstance, with any other context, other than being the miracle, this undermines one's choice, free choice of accepting God or rejecting God. There always has to be an element of question where a human being has the choice that if he wants to deny God's existence, that's his prerogative. And God always leaves that small escape route where it could be attributed to something else. And he gives an example. when the sea split at Kriyas Yamsuf, the greatest miracle ever to take place, where there's a discussion how many miracles took place at the time of the splitting of the sea. 50 miracles, 200 miracles, 250 miracles. But yet, as miraculous, as spectacular as it was, there was an introduction to the splitting of the sea. What was it? The Torah tells us that there was a wind, a fierce wind that blew throughout the night. And then what happens? Suddenly in the morning, the sea splits. So the Chinuch writes, if one wants to deny that the splitting of the sea was the hand of God, he'd say, why was it necessary to have this fierce easterly wind blowing throughout the night? It was God who split the sea. Evidently, it's not so simple. Maybe it somehow has to do with that wind. That's what caused the sea to split. And that's an example where God does not put a person in a position where he's forced to accept the hand of God, because this undermines the context of free choice. Identically, if one would extinguish the fire of the altar, one is only able to extinguish the human fire. The fire which is fueled by the wood, but the spiritual fire cannot be extinguished. God does not want that fire to be seen, the spiritual fire. Therefore, the Torah says, you must add wood multiple times throughout the day. And you're not permitted to extinguish the fire, because if you extinguish the fire, the only fire that would be extinguished is the wood, the fire which is fueled by the wood, and that will interfere and undermine one's context of free choice.